Good morning and welcome to the Daily Light Devotion. I hope all of you have had a wonderful Friday and looking forward to today. That is the 25th of July. Today, in the Old Testament, we're going to look at Psalms 44, 45, 46. And in the New Testament, we're going to look at the book of Acts, chapter 25. Um, the three Psalms 44 to 46, the theme is our faithful deliverer, our refuge, and our ever present King. These three Psalms move from the honest question during suffering to unwavering confidence in God's presence and power. The psalmist acknowledges that life brings battles and hardships, yet they continue to trust the Lord as their refuge. These Psalms reveal God's faithfulness during suffering, His power to save, His constant presence, His sovereign rule over all nations. And most importantly, they point us to Jesus, our deliverer, our refuge, our Prince of Peace. Um, Psalms 44, the sons of Korah remember God's mighty works in Israel's history. Yet they struggle because they are experiencing hardship despite remaining faithful. They cry out, "Awake, why do you sleep? Why do you sleep, O Lord?" The prayer ends by asking God to rescue them because of his unfailing love. Jesus understands undeserved suffering. He himself was rejected, mocked, crucified despite living a perfect life. Because Jesus suffered for us, he walks with us through every trial and assures us that suffering is never the end of the story. Jesus is our faithful deliverer who remains with us in every season of suffering. Psalms 45 is a royal wedding song celebrating the king. However, its language goes beyond the earthly king. It declares, "O your throne, O God, is forever and ever." The New Testament, Hebrew chapter 1, verses 8 to 9, these words are directly to Jesus. The king is righteous, majesty, victorious, and eternal. The bride is invited to rejoice in her king. So Jesus is the eternal bridegroom. He loves his church. He gave his life to redeem his bride. One day, believers will celebrate the marriage supper of the Lamb when Christ's people will rejoice his everlasting kingdom. Jesus is the eternal King who lovingly prepares his people for everlasting fellowship with him. Verses 46, sorry, so Psalms 46. This beloved psalm begins, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in the trouble. Even if mountains fall, earth shakes, nations rage, God remains unshaken." The psalm concludes with scripture's greatest invitation: "Be still and know that I am God." The peace comes from remembering that God reigns over every circumstances. Jesus calmed the storms with his words. He also calms anxious hearts with his presence. Because Christ reigns as Lord, believers can rest confidently even when the world feels unstable. Jesus is our refuge who gives perfect peace in every storm. So the key takeaways from these three Psalms are: Jesus understands our suffering. Christ is the eternal King. Jesus is our refuge and strength. God's presence is greater than every fear. We can be still because Christ reigns. Um, Moving over to the New Testament, Acts chapter 25, the theme is faithful witness, God's sovereign plan, the king above every earthly king. This chapter records Paul's appearance before the new governor, Festus, and later before King Agrippa. Although imprisoned, Paul continues to fulfill God's purpose. These verses reveal God's protection, courage under pressure, faithful testimony, and God's sovereignty over human governments. Um, Verses 1 to 12, Jewish leaders once again seek to have Paul killed. They ask Festus to transfer Paul to Jerusalem, secretly planning another ambush. God prevents their plan. When Festus suggests a trial in Jerusalem, Paul wisely exercises his right as a Roman citizen who appeals to Caesar. Jesus has already told Paul he would testify in Rome. No human plot could stop God's promises. Likewise, nothing can prevent God's purpose for our lives until his work in us is complete. Jesus faithfully accomplishes his purpose despite human opposition. Verses 13 to 22, King Agrippa and Bernice visit Festus. Festus explains Paul's case, admitting that the accusation concerns questions about Jewish religion and a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. Without realizing, Festus summarized the heart of the gospel, the resurrection of Jesus. Agrippa becomes interested and asks to hear Paul personally. Even government officials hear about Jesus because faithful believers refuse to remain silent. The resurrection remains the central message of Christian faith. Jesus' resurrection is the foundation of our witness. Verses 23 to 27, Paul is brought before an impressive gathering of military commanders and important leaders. Though he appears as a prisoner, he is actually God's ambassador. The powerful people in the room possess earthly authority, but Paul represents the King of Kings. His chains cannot silence the gospel. Jesus often works through circumstances that appear weak and unfavorable. The gospel is not because of earthly power, but because Christ reigns. God can use every situation, even imprisonment, to accomplish His mission. Jesus is the true King whose kingdom advances under every circumstances. Jesus is our refuge during trials. That is, Christ is eternal King. God's promises cannot be stopped. The resurrection remains the center of the gospel, and every circumstance can become an opportunity to testify about Jesus. These are the takeaways from this chapter. Psalms 44, 45, 46 remind us that Jesus is our deliverer, our bridegroom king, and our ever present refuge. While Acts 25 reminds us that Jesus rules over every earthly authority and faithfully opens doors for the gospel even in the middle of trials. Today, Jesus invites us to trust Him during seasons of challenges or suffering, worship Him as our eternal King, find peace in His presence, stand faithfully for the truth, and remember that no obstacle can stop God's purpose. Have a wonderful Saturday. I'll see you tomorrow. God bless you.